Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome back Muhamad Aly Rifai. He's a internal medicine physician and psychiatrist. Today's Kevin MD article is Criminalizing Care, How the System Turned on Physicians. Muhammad, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me to talk about how we can help physicians stay out of trouble and how we can, with these political and significant changes that are happening in our country, can keep physicians protected and ensure that care is not criminalized.
All right. What's this article about?
So, in the article, I introduced the fact that physicians in the United States have always been part of the pillars of ethics and trust. The Declaration of Independence was actually signed by four physicians. One of them is the father of American psychiatry, Dr. Benjamin Rush. There's other physicians, Josiah Bartlett, Lyman Hall, and Matthew Thornton. So even in the beginning of this republic, physicians have always been the pillars of trust and have been involved in the building of American democracy. So it's kind of it's heart-wrenching that we see that some physicians are ending up on the wrong side of the law and seeing that the legal system is weaponized in terms of them providing appropriate care for their patients and that care being criminalized and weaponized, and how sometimes lab coats are being exchanged for prison uniforms, and how prosecutors can pursue physicians with a real significant zeal without regard to due process or constitutional rights, and sometimes without even regard to the facts, the actual facts of the case and the medical circumstances and patient care.
So you talked about some examples of those type of cases in your article. So why don't you highlight a few?
Sure. So one of the cases is actually another fellow psychiatrist. He's a neuropsychiatrist, prominent, research-oriented neuropsychiatrist who actually saw very difficult cases, complex cases that required complex treatments, including treatments with pain medications for complex psychiatric and neurological conditions. And two of his patients had unfortunate circumstances and died. And he actually ended up being indicted for controlled substances charges and was charged actually with the death of two patients. And he was incarcerated for an extended period of time and actually decided that he wanted to go to trial because the potential charges involved actually him being in prison for life. And he ended up going to trial. And during his trial, the prosecution really turned out that they didn't have they didn't have a strong case.
Hmm.
And actually the expert witness, the forensic pathologist, the coroner who was involved in the case actually misstated facts and indicated that one of his patients had medications next to them, next to their bed, and his lawyers objected because that wasn't true. And the expert witness, the coroner, had to admit on the stand that they had mixed the facts of the case and they couldn't remember exactly what was going on. And the charges ended up being dismissed. After being prosecuted for 3.5 years, he ended up going home that day while he was facing life in prison for being a compassionate doctor who provided compassionate care to his patients who had end-stage conditions and ended up dying. So quite an unfortunate situation that Dr. Sachy faced, but he's back with his family with God's blessings.
Now, surely there are some legitimate cases where doctors are doing criminal activity. So, how often is it that they're prosecuted for nuanced issues or falsely prosecuted? How often does that really happen?
It's quite often. So the statistics are that there's about between 300 to 500 physicians that are prosecuted around the United States. And a fellow physician who was on the wrong end of the law said, a criminal prosecution next to execution is probably one of the most painful thing that could happen to any person. So it's
Mhm.
it's really, really basically something that's very, very painful. And 300 to 500 physicians are prosecuted federally throughout the United States every year. The
Hmm.
statistics are very sobering, and the majority of them actually end up pleading and not fighting their charges. And of those who go to trial, Only about maybe 30 or 40% of them are exonerated, but the majority of them will be found guilty at trial because prosecutors just have the card stacked against physicians. They don't have appropriate representation. They have public defenders. They're not able to mount a significant defense. Like in my case, I had resources and I was able to mount a significant defense and prove that actually the allegations were not true. They were basically utilizing outdated CPT coding guidelines to incriminate me while I was in the right and I was using the appropriate CPT coding guidelines. They were using outdated guidelines from 5 years earlier, and ended up being discovered on during trial on the stand, and the government's own witness, Coder, actually disavowed the government's case on the stand. She says, I'm not supporting the government's case. I'm not supporting this prosecution. I'm out of here. I'm not supporting anything. So it was quite a scene that the government's own witness that they brought in just kind of disavowed the case on the stand. So sometimes, but there are cases where physicians are guilty. And
Mhm.
physicians know that when they're guilty, they just plea. But there are physicians that ended up pleading just by fear of the outcomes, by fear of additional punishment. So if somebody doesn't plead, they get additional time, they get longer sentences because they wasted the government's time and made the government go to trial. So the system is stacked against any federal criminal defendant.
Now, are there common themes that connect these false prosecutions? Any specific types of doctors that potentially gets falsely prosecuted?
So we are seeing that there's a lot of physicians that are minority physicians that fall in for prosecutions. There's significant amount of confirmation bias. Basically, just a minority physician, the assumption is that their acts are criminal. They presume that the minority physician is going to have less resources to fight. A story of a fellow Syrian physician in Kentucky, Dr. Kousa, who was prosecuted. I mean, he's an exemplary physician, 30 years in private practice in rural Kentucky, and he was accused that he was running a pill mill.
Hmm.
And they added on top of that also charges of actually that he committed healthcare fraud by doing serial EKGs on his patient who had some QTC prolongation, and he wanted to ensure that the patient was safe. Each EKG, he charged the government $6 for them, and they charged him with healthcare fraud for 10 EKGs, $60. That was his charge because he was worried about the person having a QTC prolongation related to their medications. He also was accused that he had a pill mill, and his community actually came to his rescue. His own community pharmacist testified on his behalf. His colleagues from his own hospital testified of his exemplary record and his pristine management of patients. And he was found not guilty on all charges. So sometimes individuals who are Middle Easterns, we have a colleague who is actually currently undergoing prosecution in Philadelphia, Dr. Neil Anand, Indian ancestry, individuals who are Hispanic, individuals who are Oriental, Chinese, Koreans, Japanese. Those sometimes there's a significant confirmation bias. And the statistics do show that these individuals are prosecuted more often than their other colleagues. So it's quite unfortunate, and sometimes it takes resilience to stand up to a federal prosecution and fight back, which I'm doing right now with my prosecution, kind of suing the government back for an illegal and unjust prosecution.
Now, let's say if you are a physician that tends to be targeted, like you said, perhaps a minority physician, a physician that prescribes, say, a lot of controlled substances, is there anything that they could do to protect themselves against potentially false prosecution?
Sure, sure. So preparation, I think is very, very important. So there's like maybe 4 or 5 steps that physicians need to really adhere to. The first one is perceptions. I think perceptions is very important. When somebody comes into their office, it needs to be a pristine office, is a nice office. In the 90s, Rudy Giuliani cleared up New York City. He cleaned up the broken windows and things like that. perception. So if there's a perception that this is a pristine, nice office, clean office, staff is good, and that the room is clean, that goes a long way at
Hmm.
kind of dispelling the fact that this is a pill mill. Also preparation, having compliance, having your books, your records, your charts in order, and having an active and robust compliance program. Getting help with compliance from outside sources. So getting your charts audited before the government comes and audit them for you and finds issues with your charts. And also that if there is any issues, if there's a complaint, if there's issues that identified, investigate, 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 and document the investigation and get somebody else to help you with the investigation. And you would say, listen, I found that I prescribed too much of this medication, and maybe I need to find out how do I taper these medications of these patients. And if you bring outside help, the government will look at that very, very positively, that this person identified that maybe they were going in the wrong direction, not for any fault of their own, and they corrected. And that's a very positive thing that you can do. Also, once somebody is identified that they're under investigation, they need to seek help immediately. And they need to seek legal help, and they need also to make sure that they do not disclose anything. Never talk to the police, never talk to investigators. Make sure that your lawyer does the talking for you. So I think there's many things that our colleagues could do to ensure that they remain in a safe situation, compliance, identifying that what they're doing self audits as well as audits guided with auditing companies to make sure that they're doing okay and they're staying on the good side of the law. And if you do that, and even if there's prosecution, if there's confirmation bias that the person is going to be prosecuted, they will have a positive outcome and they'll be able to navigate through this.
We're talking to Muhamad Aly Rifai. He's an internal medicine physician, psychiatrist, and today's Kevin MD article is Criminalizing Care, How the System Turned on Physicians. Muhammad, let's end with some take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Yes, I think that this is a call for improving the ability of physicians to understand the boundaries and limits, clear regulations, ensuring that there's boundaries and limits for the Controlled Substances Act, understand that physicians have due process rights that need to be protected. And our goal is to serve our patients and serve our communities, and that goal should be lauded and respected.
Muhammad, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight. Thanks again for coming back on the show.
Thank you.